Hey guys, just wanted to go over ecology. So, ecology tends to be one of the easier topics that we talk about in living environment, predominantly because it's nothing that's all that new. A lot of the vocabulary we've mentioned throughout the year, or you've already heard when you were a little bit younger. So, first, let's talk about an ecosystem. So, an ecosystem is all the living and non living parts of the environment and how they interact together. So, if you take a look at the picture below, it would be an ecosystem. You see the sun, there's water, there's the water weeds, snail, fish. So, it's a lot of living and non living things interacting. Now, take a look at the word biotic. Bio is a prefix that means life or living. So the biotic factors are the living things, the tadpoles, the flies, the frog. A as a prefix means not. So abiotic would refer to the non living parts of an environment. So soil, pH, temperature, um, the sun, the amount of rainfall, all of that would be part of the non living ecosystem. Now, a community is basically just a step down from an ecosystem, and it just talks about the living things or the biotic factors. So, again, if we reference the picture below, it would be the tadpoles, the flies, the fish, the snails, the water weeds, and the frog. So, when we're talking about a community, we're talking about all the different organisms that live together and the way they interact. So, we're talking about a web. So, I like to talk about a spider web. Most people know what a spider web looks like. So, if you're doing a web of relationships, typically it's how everything is going to have an impact on something else. Everything is interconnected. So here's a picture of a rainforest, and you notice that even though one organism might eat something else and not another, they are all going to work together. So if you have an eagle and the eagle were to eat a smaller bird, the smaller bird might eat some seeds that are on the trees, and so on and so forth. Now, back to the abiotic versus biotic. I kind of already did address this. Again, abiotic, non living. There are some examples for you: light, heat, wind, pH. Biotic. Some of the examples they typically are going to like to use are carnivores, predators, prey, because they're more of a generalization instead of a super specific organism from one ecosystem. So carnivores are organisms that only eat meat, but in general, carnivores are alive, therefore they would be part of a biotic ecosystem. Biodiversity is super important. This is one of those topics that you will always see on the Regents exam. Again, bio meaning living, and diversity referring to a variety. So if you have biodiversity, it's talking about the number of different organisms living in an ecosystem. So when you have an ecosystem, the more biodiversity you have, the more different types of organisms you have, the more stable that ecosystem is going to be. If there was a chance that something would happen, if there was a natural disaster and a lot of the organisms did not survive, if you have 1,000 different types of organisms and you lost 10%, you'd still have 900 different organisms living in that area. If you only had 100 organisms living in an area, and again, you lost 10%, now you're down to 90. So the more different types of organisms, the more stable the ecosystem, and it's able to survive something happening to it. So physical factors, that's going to play a role. So if the temperature were to change drastically, either direction becomes super hot, super cold, and the organisms are not used to that, they might not be able to survive. If for some reason a number of the organisms were to die out and then food would become limited, that can play a role on all the other organisms that are living there in the ecosystem. The same thing, if there were too many organisms in an area, it could limit the amount of water available. Or again, going back to the amount of food, if you have a lot of organisms, you're going to need a lot of food available for them. So all of these things can play a part in the amount of organisms that are able to live in an area and therefore impact the biodiversity and the stability. So for humans, human activities are going to have an impact on an ecosystem. Think about, carpooling. Um, if you have less emissions going into the air, we're going to have less pollution. There is a link between the amount of carbon dioxide in the environment and the temperature of the world, or global warming. Um, and again, when going back to the biodiversity, if you're going to look at an ocean versus a lake, lakes tend to be smaller and have limited amounts of organisms, where an ocean is, so vast, we don't even know all the different organisms that are in the oceans. Same thing goes for the rainforest. They find new organisms in rainforests every day, as opposed to maybe like a grassland or a desert. Succession is another term that typically is going to show up on the regions. A lot of times with succession, they show this in a picture. So succession is very similar to evolution, except for succession is the replacement of organisms over time, where evolution is the change in organisms over time. So with succession, typically what's going to happen is there's some sort of event that will destroy an ecosystem, either completely or enough that it needs to start again. So if there were a forest fire, or if there was a volcano, if there was a hurricane and something destroyed an ecosystem, it would have to start anew. Now, something else to remember about succession is that whatever that ecosystem was before it was destroyed, that's what it's going to go back to. So if you had a deciduous forest and it was destroyed all the way down to dirt and soil, it eventually should become that forest again. It might take hundreds of years for all of those organisms to come back, but as long as the climate doesn't change, meaning that there is not a huge change in the temperature and a huge change in the amount of water, it should go back to what it was. So, succession is the replacement of one type of organism or community by another, little by little over time. Now, going along with succession is pioneer species. So, pioneer species is the first organisms that are going to appear. So, if you look over here on the picture, it starts off as little flowers and then gets a little bit like a little bit grass, into bushes, into little trees, and then into a forest again. So again, things that can destroy an area are going to be a volcano, and typically a forest fire. But notice how time is going to be on your x-axis, because time, little by little, should be replacing all the different organisms. So going back to our pioneer species, typically lichens and moss are going to be the first pioneer species that you're going to see. You can also have bacteria or algae act as a pioneer species. And again, pioneer meaning first, the first organisms that are going to appear after that destroyed ecosystem, and they are able to turn it into something that's able to change and be replaced into the new ecosystem. So there's a couple of different major biological communities. So these are even grander and larger than an ecosystem. And this is where you're going to talk about a biome. So, a biome is a large region characterized by a specific type of climate and certain kinds of plants and animals. So, the biggest deciding factor when you're labeling your biomes deals with temperature and precipitation. So, temperature, how hot or cold that area is going to be, and precipitation, the amount of rainfall that you're going to see. And when we talk about rainfall, that could also mean snow. So it's basically any type of water that is going to be falling. So hopefully this helps to clarify anything that you guys had to fill in with your guided notes. If you do have any questions, please feel free to, either send me an email or just reach out to me. And I hope that you're all good. Thanks.